in my state and across this country. I have no doubt that each of my colleagues who will be joining the discussion today has a story to tell about how climate change is impacting their communities, and particularly climate-related disasters. And of course, I want to extend a special welcome to my friend, the mayor of La Crosse, Wisconsin, Mayor Cabot, who has demonstrated exceptional leadership of his Mississippi River town during multiple major flooding events in recent years. Empowering local leaders like Mayor Cabot to prevent damage is wiser and more fiscally responsible than scrambling to rebuild over and over after disasters hit. And that has been our approach in the past, and it simply cannot continue to be our only response to this mounting crisis. The federal government is fortunate to have an abundance of climate data and expert scientists who produce it. The problem is not lack of knowledge about climate change and what it will bring. The problem is applying the knowledge that we already have to how we design, build, and live in our communities. I'd like to talk a little bit about the changes we are seeing in Wisconsin. Over the last century, overall precipitation across the United States increased 4%. In the Great Lakes region, it increased nearly 10%. This increase is largely driven by extreme precipitation events, such as a day in August of 2018 when La Crosse, Wisconsin received nearly 10 inches of rain. Extreme events like this are no longer the exception. There's feedback. Does everyone hear that? Let's try the other one and just see if that makes a difference. Testing. Oh, so the chairman, no, it's still the same. Oh, well, we're going to keep on going. All right. Extreme events like this are no longer the exception. Infrastructure that has withstood storms for decades is now failing. Our infrastructure was not built to handle rain like this. In these photos from La Crosse, you can see the devastating impact storms can have, destroying critical infrastructure like bridges, roads, and rail lines. Damage like this is a significant economic disruption, particularly in areas, in rural areas. In northwest Wisconsin, on Lake Superior, in July of 2016, a county-owned harbor and marina sustained nearly $10 million of damage from intense rainfall and flooding. You can see some of the damage in the poster to my left. In the midst of rebuilding efforts, which required dredging of the harbor, another serious flood took place in 2018. This damage closed the harbor for over three years, resulting in nearly $500,000 of missed revenue for the county. For a small rural county, this is incredibly significant. Climate extremes affect our Great Lakes and the people and communities near them. Lake Michigan's water levels currently sit 3 feet above long-term averages in our state. This means that coastal communities are even more vulnerable to flooding during the extreme rain events. Some Wisconsinites living on the lakes are facing extreme erosion that threatens their property and public infrastructure. As you can see in this poster of a bluff collapsing into the lake on Lake Michigan's coast in Mount Pleasant, Wisconsin. These events are not mere inconveniences. These are fundamental and dangerous disruptions to people's lives. And after a bridge washes out or a shoreline is eroded, communities need the tools, funding, and information to build better and more resilient infrastructure that can withstand this new reality of more severe weather. Many communities in Wisconsin are focused on building back stronger and more resilient because they know and live the reality of a changing climate every day, and they know the enormous local costs to taxpayers. Unfortunately, a lot of the tools communities have right now are delaying or even preventing actions to rebuild stronger and more resilient infrastructure. Federal aid can be held up, making it difficult to move forward with the repairs critical to daily life. Sometimes regulations make it harder for communities to act on information they have and make strategic investments in the future. That's why I introduced the bipartisan Rebuilding Stronger Infrastructure Act to help ensure emergency highway funding can be used to fund roads and bridges that withstand the next storm. I appreciate the support of Ranking Member Carper, who worked with me to include this language in EPW's Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill. Climate change is certainly a big global problem, but it also, just as importantly, it's a local reality. Things are changing. Communities are struggling to stay ahead of those changes, and we need to partner with our community. We need to partner with our communities, towns, and cities, counties, and states to do more. Fortunately, people across Wisconsin and across our country are leading the way to find their own solutions. The city of La Crosse provides funding for people to relocate out of high-risk areas. Local leaders are championing innovative nature-based solutions to reduce flooding pressure. These are wise investments that use taxpayer dollars strategically and guard against future loss of property and life. The federal government should encourage communities to pursue forward-looking solutions like these. It's clear that our current approach is not sustainable, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about their recommendations for confronting this problem affecting communities across our country. Thank you for being here today to share your expertise on the critical challenge of building a nation that is physically prepared to withstand climate change. Senator Carper, I just gave you a shout out before you walked in about my gratitude for including building stronger infrastructure resilience language into the EPW's version of transportation reauthorization. I'm about to recognize you for your opening statement, but I want to also just recognize that we have been joined by our colleague on the Special Committee on the Climate Crisis, Senator Catherine Cortez Masto.
Why don't you go first?
No, please go right ahead.
Are you sure?
Because we haven't heard, we want to hear from you and then the witnesses.
Thanks so much for hosting us and for chairing this, Senator Baldwin, and giving us a chance to speak. To our witnesses, welcome. Delighted to see each of you. This is sometimes we have issues that are not all that relevant to the states that we represent. Sometimes we have issues that are really relevant, and it's hard to find one that's more relevant than climate change to Delaware. We care about other things too, but we really care about climate change. Senator Coons and I and Lisa Blunt Rochester over in the House are privileged to represent the lowest lying state in America. Our state is slowly sinking. The seas around us are rising. It's not a good combination. And in some parts of our state, we've got an hour or so of rain. Our roads become impassable. It's not just in one part of the state, it is in different parts of the state, restricting the flow of commerce, even putting people trying to travel at risk. We've also witnessed the destructive forces of hurricanes, of nor'easters, of blizzards, superstorms like Sandy, and the list goes on. In other parts of the country where we live, the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, we're experiencing more and more rain events that are measured not by the inch, but by the foot. Not too far away from where we are right now, a place called Ellicott City, a lovely place, I'm told, in Maryland, has withstood not one but 2,000-year floods in less than 2 years. Now, there's a reason why they call them a 1,000-year flood. It's because they're expected to occur once every 1,000 years. They've had two of them. in 2 years. Scientists tell us that climate change was connected to the torrential rains, the snowfall, the conditions that led to record-breaking flooding that inundated towns and highways across the Midwest earlier this year. I was in parts of the Midwest about a month ago out there stumping for a guy from Delaware who's running for president. And I remember going for a run on a Sunday morning when I was there along the Missouri River, a great river run, and you could still see, like months and months after the floods, what had happened and the kind of damage that they had sustained. Further south down in Louisiana, climate change and sea level rise are eroding the coastline, forcing the state to take on massive restoration efforts. Our oldest son, Christopher, lives out in California, the northern part of California, and they've had firestorms there, hurricane-force winds in those firestorms bigger than my state, and not just one or two of them, but persistently. Extreme weather events are happening more frequently and, frankly, wreaking havoc on our transportation infrastructure, costing hundreds of billions of dollars of damage every year. Across our country, in red states and in blue states, alike, our roads, our highways, our bridges are the front lines of the climate crisis, and that's why it's important that we focus on resilience, and I'm glad we have a chance to do that today. Earlier this year, as our colleague, Senator Baldwin has said earlier, this year the Environment and Public Works Committee, which I serve as ranking member, chaired by Republican John Barrasso, we reported out bipartisan legislation to reauthorize our nation's surface transportation programs. We don't do a whole lot of bipartisan stuff, although in our committee we do. But we try to set an example to the rest of the three other committees that are involved in surface transportation legislation. And we try to set an example for them by reporting our bill out 21-0 back in, the middle part of the summer. Our bill is called the America's Transportation Infrastructure Act. I'm not a big fan of acronyms. I'll use one reluctantly. It's called ATIA, A-T-I-A. Includes the first ever climate title in a bill of its kind. I'm proud of that. We're proud of that. With provisions aimed at improving the resiliency of our transportation infrastructure to climate change and to natural disasters. ATIA would invest nearly $5 billion to improve the resiliency of roads and bridges from natural disasters and extreme weather events. Nearly $4 billion, that's $4 billion out of the 5, would be distributed to states automatically through what we call a formula approach. Another $1 billion would be states could compete for that money amongst themselves. We have created a brand new grant program. It's called Protect, P-R-O-T-E-C-T, not to be confused with Respect, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, Protect. And Protect grants program would support projects that reinforce, that upgrade, or realign existing transportation infrastructure to better withstand extreme weather. The program also includes funds dedicated specifically to coastal state resiliency and to fund emergency evacuation routes. This legislation, ATIA, harnesses the power of Mother Nature through the use of natural infrastructure, such as wetlands, to protect roads and storm surges during tropical cyclones, during hurricanes, during nor'easters. Our legislation also establishes new eligibility for natural infrastructure in the National Highway Performance Program and for the Emergency Relief Program. In addition to ATIA, there is America's Water Infrastructure Act, known as, we call it WERDA, W-E-R-D-A. It's the Water Resources Development Act, which was signed into law in October last year. Currently, our committee is developing the next WERDA for 2020. About every 2 years, we try to update it and pass it. So it's like, think of it as, let's say, the water piece, water part of our national infrastructure, including drinking water, wastewater, bridges, and not bridges, but coasts and waterways. When many people think of infrastructure, our country's water infrastructure oftentimes goes unnoticed, even though it impacts every community throughout our state, throughout our country. Our water infrastructure system supports the important work done by the Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA, including flood control, beach and shoreline maintenance, and maintenance of inland and coastal waterways through which a lot of goods travel. It's critical that we continue to invest to ensure our water infrastructure can withstand the next extreme weather event and continue to provide these benefits. The need for greater resiliency can be seen all around us. It's the flooded highways that separate a city or a drinking water supply that's contaminated from storm water. It is tidal flooding that snarls busy roads on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of the work week as well. We close by saying enhancing our infrastructure's resiliency is critical to adapting to a new climate reality. And we should seize this opportunity to foster long-term economic growth and protect our communities. There's I don't know a lot of Latin, but the words carpe diem come to mind, which means seize the day. In Delaware, we say it carpe diem. And so I think the key here is to seize the day, and we hope that's one that we can salute together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Carper. We are also joined right now by the chairman of our special committee on the climate crisis, Brian Schatz, and we have also been joined by Senator Tina Smith. I will proceed to introduce briefly the three witnesses that we have, and we can begin to hear their testimony. For members, I will also note that I just was alerted that the second vote has commenced at 2:45, and I understand as people have to come in and out in order to cast their votes on the floor. We have with us today Alice Hill. She is the Senior Fellow for Climate Change Policy on the Council of Foreign Relations. Alice Hill's work at the Council on Foreign Relations focuses on risks, consequences, and responses associated with climate change. She was previously a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, special assistant to President Obama, and senior director for resilience policy on the National Security Council staff. At the White House, she led the development of policy regarding national security and climate change, built climate resilience considerations and capabilities into international development and other federal initiatives, and developed national risk management standards for the most damaging natural hazards. Next, from the Mississippi River city of La Crosse, Wisconsin, we have Mayor Tim Cabot. He was first elected mayor of La Crosse in April 2013 with 64% of the vote, winning all of the city's 29 wards. He ran unopposed and was elected to a second term in April 2017. Mayor Cabot oversees the city's 17 departments, 520 employee workforce, and manages its $71 million annual operating budget, long-term borrowing, and debt service. I could go on at length, but I just want everyone to know that I've seen firsthand his leadership with regard to assisting the La Crosse community and surrounding areas with the very real and present challenge of frequent flooding and extreme weather events. And I know how strongly committed he is to his community's safety and resilience. So we appreciate your traveling here to be here today. Laura Lightbody is the project director for flood prepared communities at the Pew Charitable Trusts. In the Pew's Flood Prepared Communities Initiative, the aim is reforming flood and disaster policy to be better prepared for future flooding. She previously served as a manager for Pew's Clean Energy Initiative, and in 2007, as a communications consultant, played a critical role in the passage of the first increase in federal fuel efficiency standards for cars and light trucks in more than 30 years. I am delighted to have all of you here and would like to proceed in the order that I introduced you. Ms. Hill, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Thank you so much, Senator Baldwin and members of the committee, Chairman Schatz. It's my honor to be before you here today, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Natural disasters are on the rise. The costs of weather and climate-related disasters are also rising. Between 1980 and 2018, the United States suffered 254 weather and climate-related disasters, carrying a price tag of over $1 billion each. From 1980 to 2013, the average was 6.3 such billion-dollar events per year. But for the years from 2013 to 2018, the annual average doubled to 12.6 events. When communities suffer devastation, Americans respond with generosity. The Congress has increasingly authorized supplemental appropriations to provide relief to local and state governments overwhelmed by disasters, to small businesses, and individuals who have suffered losses, and to repair damaged federal assets. In light of the growing fiscal exposure to the federal government from climate change-based disasters, the GAO has identified climate change as a high risk since 2013. Notably, the federal government has comparatively little say in state and local choices about land use and construction quality. Yet it is the federal government that frequently picks up the bill for those choices after disaster strikes. In the face of accelerating climate change, the federal government must reduce the incentives for people to settle in at-risk areas and to build in risky ways. As you have noted, Senator Baldwin, we need to provide technical assistance on the ground to those who must make the decisions. As one part-time mayor of a small town in Alabama, which faces risk of coastal erosion from sea level rise and more intense hurricanes, lamented in 2014, I don't have a big planning staff, grant writers, or any resources. So how can I even know the size of the threats we are facing, and what can I do to protect the people of my town? This mayor is not alone. The federal government urgently needs to create a system for providing meaningful technical assistance to decision makers. In 2015, the GAO concluded that the federal government's network of climate data remains so disjointed that decision makers are vastly underserved. Because of this uncoordinated approach, federal, state, local, and private sector decision makers may be unaware that climate information exists or may be unable to use what is available. We also need resilient building codes. A 2018 study by the National Institute of Building Sciences found that designing buildings to meet the latest model building codes yields a national benefit of $11 for every $1 invested. Despite the case for strong building codes, the Federal Emergency Management Administration estimates that only 32% of disaster-prone jurisdictions have adopted disaster-resistant building codes. This means that close to 70% of disaster-prone jurisdictions are at greater risk of damage for which the federal government may ultimately be asked to pay. We need to make sure that the federal government is urging and insisting upon adoption of the latest model building codes, as well as resilient building codes when there are no such codes for climate risk. We also need to restrict development in at-risk areas. Despite the increasing risk from climate change, the federal government continues to subsidize new development in high-risk areas through the National Flood Insurance Program and other federal programs, including federally backed mortgages. Going forward, the federal government should no longer provide incentives for people to put themselves and their businesses in places of known and growing risk. Finally, it is estimated that early warning systems not only save lives, but also assets worth at least 10 times the cost of such systems. The federal government should provide monetary assistance to help state and local governments develop and maintain such systems. The federal government can act to help reduce losses from weather and climate-related disasters. Given the projected magnitude, it's time we do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Mayor Tim Kabat.
Thank you. Chairman Schatz and members of the Senate Special Committee, Thank you for inviting me here today. I would like to convey a special note of gratitude to Senator Baldwin for her leadership and commitment to giving the people of our state a voice in this process. I am Tim Cabot, the mayor of La Crosse, Wisconsin. I also serve as the Wisconsin chair of the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. The initiative is comprised of 95 mayors along the Mississippi River from the headwaters to the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, there are 3 Mississippi River states that are represented on this committee, and that includes my fellow state chairs, Sean Dowse of Red Wing, Minnesota, and Rick Eberlin of Grafton, Illinois. The Mississippi River is the most important waterway in the world. The main stem moves 40% of U.S. agricultural output, and the 31-state river basin produces more agricultural commodities than any other river basin in the world. Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois are among the top 10 performing states for cash receipts generated from agricultural production, and 1 out of every 12 people on Earth ingests commodities that are produced in the Mississippi River Basin. Yet all of this economic and export potential is at grave risk from persistent and catastrophic disasters. From 2005 to 2019, our river corridor has sustained more than $2 billion in losses due to natural disasters. Besides flooding, we are just as concerned about drought and intensifying heat. The drought of 2012 in our region cost us $35 billion in losses and was the second most expensive disaster on Earth that year. In La Crosse, in our region, we experienced severe storm events in 2017 and 2018 that caused millions of dollars in damage to private property and our infrastructure, and we're still actually working to recover from these events. This year's flood, 2019, was the largest and longest in U.S. recorded history. The flood stretched from my area in Wisconsin to New Orleans and spanned from Pennsylvania to Oklahoma. In La Crosse, we were above flood stage for 89 days. We shattered records for the highest average April, May, October, and November river stages in a year. And we have a very well-designed and well-executed response to when we're preparing for high river levels that include temporary earthen levees. Our temporary levees are not meant to be in place for 90-plus days, and that was the case this year. Illinois communities along the river lost as much as 80% of their season economy. Red Wing sits on the river just 90 miles north of La Crosse, and if Mayor Dowse were here, he would talk about the damage they sustained and how the community of Red Wing is working to finance that recovery. We're looking at an estimated impact of over $2 billion in damage in the Mississippi River corridor and $4 billion over the larger basin. In La Crosse, not only am I a proud member of the Mississippi River Initiative, I'm also a proud member of the Climate Mayors. There are over 400 of us that are committed to meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Accord. Our Common Council actually just adopted legislation earlier this year for La Crosse to become carbon neutral by the year 2050. We also are very active in managing our La Crosse floodplain, and that's especially critical because we have more than 1,900 structures that are located within the special flood hazard area, 90% of them built before 1971, before we even had firm and flood insurance maps. The mayors along the Mississippi River are committed to pursuing several strategies. These include meeting our impacts at a corridor scale. With me today, I'm pleased to announce that Mayor Belinda Constant of Gretna, Louisiana is here. She thought it was important to be here to show that this is truly a corridor-wide effort. We are also all about innovative finance options. We are very proud to talk about the Resilience Revolving Loan Fund Act of 2019 that prioritizes projects that have natural infrastructure. And then just very quickly on the reauthorization of WRDA, we would recommend 3 priorities. 1, disaster prediction improvements. 2, a natural infrastructure mitigation capacity study, and 3, a recovery bond pilot. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Cabot. I would now like to recognize Laura Lightbody for her testimony, and with apologies that I'm going to go cast a vote and come right back. And our chairman's in charge for that moment.
Well, thank you for your leadership on this, and thank you, Chairman Schatz, for your leadership as well, and the rest of the committee members. Thank you for your invitation. I'm honored to be here to discuss policies that to prepare for the increasingly severe and frequent extreme weather. As mentioned, I represent Pew. Our program is focused on floods. Why floods? Because flooding is the nation's most common and costly natural disaster, as states like Hawaii and Wisconsin know all too well, impacting every single state across the country. Flood and coastal storm events have cost the U.S. over $845 billion in losses since 2000. And as climate change worsens, those numbers will undoubtedly rise. We must meet these challenges with federal policies that prevent short-sighted development and rebuilding, which damages the very natural resources that can protect us. We must also help states and localities by equipping communities with resources, data, and tools to improve resiliency. Pew puts forward 5 recommendations that Congress can take now, all of which are addressed at length in my written testimony. I will focus on 3 in particular today. First, plan for the future. Public infrastructure has long been constructed based on historical data, outdated standards, resulting in repeatedly damaged assets, communities shut down for weeks, and rising costs. Congress can ensure more resilient infrastructure by requiring that newly built or repaired federally funded projects such as roads and hospitals are not built in high-risk areas. If they must, at a minimum, Congress should require projects to incorporate future flood risks, such as sea level rise and increased rainfall, into their design and siting. Unfortunately, an executive order doing just that, the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, was repealed in 2017. This updated policy recognized that the calculation of the so-called 100-year floodplain is not a prediction of future risk. It recognized that much of the nation's flooding occurs in areas beyond what the flood maps can tell us, and that flood risks are dynamic due to climate change as well as land use and demographic changes. Without this directive, federally funded infrastructure continues to be built only based on historical data. We recommend that Congress apply an updated flood-ready standard for all new federal investments, just as the Department of Defense now does. Second, invest in preparedness, a common theme on this panel. The federal government should end its bias for post-disaster assistance over support for adaptation and pre-disaster mitigation. Research shows that mitigation saves society $6 for every $1 invested. Pew strongly supports congressional investments in preparedness for states, including a flood mitigation revolving loan fund, which was introduced by Senators Reid, Menendez, and Kennedy, new pre-disaster funding for highways, in addition to resilience provisions and funding that was passed by Senator Carper's committee by EPW earlier this year, full funding of FEMA's new Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities program, and other mitigation programs at NOAA and HUD. We also support Chairman Schatz's proposal requiring that flood-prone communities plan for mitigation that have suffered repeated flooding. By making these resources available through these programs, the federal government will help states build their own capacity to improve resilience. And lastly, create a new partnership with states. The federal-state resilience partnership should be a two-way street. We encourage senators to re-examine the concept of a disaster deductible, first proposed by FEMA in 2016. This concept that would condition and scale the levels of certain post-disaster federal assistance based on a state's own investment in disaster preparedness, which could spur better mitigation policies by states and localities, resulting in reduced costs overall. I want to thank the committee for the opportunity to comment on how improved federal and state policy can make our communities and infrastructure more flood ready. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thanks.
Thank you to all the testifiers. I'll start with the mayor. First of all, thank you for making your way here, and thank you for your great work. I want to talk to you about the creditworthiness of municipalities and whether or not the conversation about climate risk has started to impact the way you're interacting with bond counsel and all the rest of it, and whether that's flowing down to your departments of fiscal services or whatever it may be. It seems to me that some of these rating agencies are starting to dig into this question more seriously, and I'm wondering whether you're feeling it on the ground.
We are. That is really what we're looking for at the local level are flexible ways to try to fund really a large variety of these types of projects. We do have our typical infrastructure and capital budgets each and every year, but that only goes so far, and especially a state like Wisconsin where we have levy limits, we're pretty well limited each year to what we can invest. One of the key aspects of our Mississippi River group is the innovative financing things that we're looking at. So it's the green bond options. It's looking at ways that through the Resilience Revolving Loan Fund, which is something that's been introduced on the House side, that would provide funds to localities to be able to use that for green infrastructure and the flexibility that allows, and then be able to work with our other partners to make sure that we are achieving high standards. Because I would agree with the testimony. We need to look at our infrastructure much differently because most of ours was built 100 years ago, and even though there was flooding back then, it's not to the extent that we're seeing today.
Right. Thank you. Ms. Lightbody, how do we do managed retreat in a democracy?
Just like many of the solutions to flooding managed retreat, there isn't one solution that fits all communities. I think we're starting to see some of that happen in some of the most impacted communities. Louisiana and New Jersey are taking a hard look at really when does it make sense, and when do you have a willing community that would like
But I
to
guess
move
that's
to higher ground.
That's the nub of it, right? Which is that it seems to me it has to be voluntary, or it ought to be voluntary, given that we're a free country. But there may be a point at which the scale of the problem overcomes everyone's individual desire to hold on to their private property. And I don't have an answer. This is not a leading question. Right. And I think we have a little bit of time. We don't have a lot of time in sort of geological terms, but in terms of public policy, I don't think we want to rush into managed retreat because we'll end up with a Biggert Waters sort of situation where you get the backlash and nobody's really sure why that thing was passed, but suddenly their insurance rates go up, and then you get the, excuse me for mixing my political situation, then you get a yellow vest situation where people are saying, hey, all that climate stuff is really important, but I'm being financially harmed by your solution. So I think we really need to do some work here. Ms. Hill, you look like you want to get in there.
Yes, I do recognize this is still managed retreat is a very difficult conversation. We've seen in California, city of Del Mar, basically the residents rejected the concept. It's going to be a hard conversation going forward. For the federal government, I believe that there could be a bright line that the federal government will no longer invest in risky areas. So if cities, towns, individuals, private sector want to invest in a flood zone or in a high fire risk zone, as we're seeing in California, it won't be using taxpayer dollars from Maine, from Wisconsin, from wherever.
Well, I can see that if you're talking about, say, the Department of Defense and resources like that. But I think it gets a little more dicey if you're saying, look, we're going to withhold federal funding from American citizens because you live in the wrong place.
For new development, I think that we should be sending a signal that we do not want new development. And we've seen what's happened post-Sandy in New Jersey. We've seen more development in risky areas than non-risky areas. And, of course, that comes with...
Because risky areas are by the ocean.
Right. They're attractive to people, as are as living in a forest. But we know now with climate change that that's going to cause a drain on the federal treasury. So we need to start somewhere. It seems to me new development is a place. And then we have the Coastal Barriers Resources Act, where we basically, as a nation, said these areas are too risky. We're going to retreat. And again, we're not going to support the decision to be located there. Not stopping anyone, to your point. It's still democracy, and people can still choose to live there.
but they're not entitled to the subsidy. Fair enough. I just think this is not in the halls of Congress and even in the conference rooms in my Senate office. These are simple conversations. In communities, they get really hard really quick, and you find out that, you know, when you imagine a coastal community, you're imagining Del Mar or Malibu or Portlock or Kahala in my state. But then you find out that people who are impacted by the new flood maps, which are increasingly accurate, are low and middle income or fixed income people who live along the river on Kauai. And so it becomes incredibly challenging to try to get this policy right without accelerating the harm that is already happening. And, by the way, accentuating the legacy of all of the zoning and restrictive covenants, which were the sort of first cousin of Jim Crow in the first place. So as I sit on this committee, but I also sit on the banking committee, I worry that whatever climate policy solutions need to have a human and community overlay. I don't think there's a crisp solution yet, but I do think this is one where we should measure twice, cut once, because we can only get one backlash before we lose 10 or 20 or 30 years and are unable to take action in this space.
Okay.
Sure, Mr. Mayor.
I would just say, just a real quick example in La Crosse. I had touched on the fact that much of our community was developed before there were flood insurance maps, and so we have whole neighborhoods that have been developed that we're trying to look at solutions to acquire property, to relocate, to then raise, blocks, but it's very expensive at the local level. Just one block in our town to acquire all the property, to deal with infrastructure, it's at least $3 million. We don't have that kind of resource when you're talking about dozens and dozens of blocks. And the real world or the human side of this, I mean, we have folks that are still pumping water out of their basements in October and November. Those homes have been there forever and ever, and the surroundings have changed. So what can we do to try to make their homes tougher and more resilient? We're doing some things like, filling in basements and trying to approach it from that standpoint. Again, these are all small examples, but when you're talking about neighborhoods in a large community, you can't just pick everybody up and go somewhere.
Thank you.
Great discussion. I want to just, before asking Mayor Cabot a question, you were using the analogy, Mr. Chairman, of Del Mar and Malibu, but that picture right there is in Racine County, the town of Mount Pleasant. These are working class homes that are on Lake Michigan. And so it really is a situation that affects so many. And many of these homes, it appears, may have to be condemned because of the risk of them falling right into the lake if they're not able to respond in other ways to that lakeshore erosion. So that's the east coast of Wisconsin, but now I want to turn to the west coast of Wisconsin. We do think of ourselves as a state with three coasts, that it would be Lake Michigan on the east coast, Lake Superior on the north coast, and the St. Croix and mighty Mississippi on our west coast. So Mayor Cabot, by virtue of your city's location on the Mississippi, as you mentioned in your testimony, you're really a part of a collection of interconnected communities by virtue of sharing this riverway. And so you're affected by the decisions of those upstream from you, and you are influencing the experiences of those downstream from you. After disasters occur, I would like to hear how you and other city leaders have collaborated with neighboring cities, counties, and of course, even states, because in the case of the Mississippi, it's what separates us in most of the length of it from other states. How have you collaborated, and how could these partnerships help you respond to or reduce the impact of future disasters?
We do communicate as a group of communities. That's been one of the, I think, great benefits of being part of our Mississippi River Cities and Towns initiative is that ideal that it is one river and we are one group of communities, and what we do definitely impacts what happens downstream. As far as our to help us further that collaboration, I would point out that through the mayor's advocacy in our pre-disaster mitigation grant program, a year or two ago, that was modified to allow multiple state applications where that was not the case, historically. So the fact that we could potentially work with the mayor of Winona, Minnesota, on a project or ways to help create more green infrastructure, it would help us because that's upriver from us, and then obviously help the downstream communities as well. I think anything and everything that we can do to continue to collaborate and communicate especially is helpful to mayors, because we're at times scrambling to get the best information, and that's where our collaboration with the USGS and others to try to get water quality monitoring and just to know those impacts is so critical.
Thank you. Ms. Lightbody, in your testimony, you touched upon the value of prioritizing nature-based solutions. The city of Milwaukee, through the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District, is working to curb flooding from heavy rains with green infrastructure projects. Solutions including rain gardens, drainage channels, and other flood management projects. What more do you think the federal role should be? What should the federal government be doing to partner with local entities of these on these types of green infrastructure projects to be able to improve resiliency?
That's a great question, and we're so excited we're starting to see more and more of that integration of nature-based solutions, whether that's along riverine areas, coastal areas. One of the examples that I like to point out is after Hurricane Irene in North Carolina, you had a home that had used natural marshes and grasses called a living shoreline to address coastal erosion next to a home that had a hard bulkhead to address coastal erosion and flooding. After Hurricane Irene, the bulkhead was destroyed. The natural infrastructure proved to reduce flooding. That home had no damage, and the home next to it did. The federal government can really send a message to these communities that nature-based solution is valued as a form of mitigation, and provide data and resources and tools on how to undertake nature-based solutions, because it is sort of an emerging technology, if you will, when it comes to mitigation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. If you're ready, Senator Smith, I would recognize my neighbor on the other side of the Mississippi River for questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Senator. Oh, here. Thank you, Senator Baldwin. First, I just want to welcome Mayor Cabot, who feels almost
Thank
like
you.
a Minnesota mayor.
Right.
There we go, on the other side of the river.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate the work that you've done with the Mississippi mayors on the importance of the Mississippi River, and also on these issues around climate and climate resilience. So just thank you a ton for this. And you were talking about the issue of, in your testimony, you were talking about the issue of kind of disaster predictions and how to predict this. And it's so very interesting to me because just a couple of days ago, maybe even today, in the Star Tribune, there is a story about how protecting floodplains from development would actually would significantly save money versus, did you talk about this already, Tammy? Significantly save money versus paying for the inevitable flood damage that would happen as a result of what will happen because of flooding. And this is research that was done by the Nature Conservancy and the University of Bristol and published in the journal Nature Sustainability just recently. So could you just elaborate a little bit? This is really sort of a question for all of you. Just elaborate a little bit on this question of disaster sort of predictions. And a lot of the decisions we make are based on the maps that we have right now for floodplains, yet in Minnesota, and I suspect all over the country, including in Wisconsin, those maps are outdated. And so would you just talk a little bit about that from your perspective as a mayor?
I can give you.
And then the others, I'd love to hear your perspectives too.
A couple of quick examples. So the water monitoring net that we're trying to work with USGS on the whole length of the river corridor to have real-time data on what's going on with water levels, water quality. We just announced a partnership with one of the steamboat companies to deploy these monitors on the barges so that as ships are traveling, they can get that and collect that data and provide that to mayors. So that's one aspect that we would like to see more of that. And there is funding, I believe it's $11 million or somewhere in that range to expand upon what USGS is already doing. And then as a part of the WRDA reauthorization, the disaster prediction improvements, there was it's similar to what was authorized in the WRDA 2014, but with additional hardware and software aimed at capturing more real-time data of water levels and inundation mapping. And in La Crosse, right now we're going through a fairly significant local expense to in essence kind of prove to the state and the feds that the maps don't actually match with what happens during a storm event.
Right.
In 2017, we had a 50-year rainfall. It was 6 inches or something like that in an hour and a half. We could see what it did on the ground in our storm sewers and everything else. And so now we're working with our partners at the state and federal level to actually adjust the maps to show these are areas that really weren't impacted, and then these are areas that will be impacted. And if we could work on those types of mapping changes, again, that would provide us with much better information.
Yeah, please.
And I would just add, we have two main federal programs right now that are really contributing to that risk growing. The floodplain building standards are outdated and they're allowing risky development in the mapped areas. The areas that we have said are the riskiest flood risk areas.
Right.
We have
and that's current maps, not like the maps as they
exactly
should be.
But
Right.
even in those current maps, we're allowing really risky development with outdated standards and based on historical data. We've got to update the flood risk management standard. The second is the federal flood insurance program continues to offer new subsidized rates for new construction. I think we agree on this a lot here, that we cannot continue to offer subsidized rates to new development. Let's not grow this risk when we know about the problems today.
Yes.
I appreciate your focus on mapping. I think this should be a core federal function to guide where federal investments should be made. The maps would need to be updated frequently. And as we've heard from the mayor, obviously with a great deal of input from the local communities who understand their topography probably better than the experts in Washington. But there needs to be a shared understanding of risk, and that includes wildfires, because just as we're seeing development in areas at risk of flooding, we're seeing development in areas at risk of wildfires, but very few areas, and I'm not aware of any wildfire areas yet, that have reflect maps with future risk on them, and that shouldn't be so. The federal government has great resources and should undertake this task, in my opinion.
Right. Thank you. That's very helpful.
I want to follow up on Senator Baldwin's questions regarding nature-based solutions. And the way we have worked with the Army Corps under the authorizing law is that we have flood control projects and we have ecosystem restoration projects, and never the twain shall meet. Even though that makes no sense. I live in the Alawai watershed, and we are required to do a flood control project that looks pretty much like a traditional flood control project, although we're making improvements to it. But on the other side of the Ko'olau mountain range, you have the Kauainui Marsh, which was a partnership with the state government to maintain the ecosystem services that the marsh already provided, and you don't need quite as much of a build out in terms of dams and everything else because they've just retained the marsh. And so I'd like Ms. Hill for you to comment, and perhaps Ms. Lightbody, if you're aware of this issue. Shouldn't we just change the statute to be a little more permissive when we're working with the Army Corps so that they don't define flood control as sort of channelizing, widening, hardening in every instance?
I agree. We know that green infrastructure can be more effective, save a lot of money, and also buy us time. So it should be in the range of tools that are available. We often see most communities, their knee-jerk reaction when they recognize flooding is we want a seawall, but we need to help people work through to understand the gains that can be had from green infrastructure. And I think there should be no barriers to allowing investment in that. And that includes other climate resilient investments as well, but that's an obvious one that needs to be raised on the agenda of making sure it's constantly in the list of considerations of how to approach risk.
Ms. Lightbody?
I agree. They can also take a note from some other agencies that are working to integrate nature-based solutions, FEMA, some of the transportation reauthorization bills are looking at how nature-based can really integrate with the core goal of those agencies. And there are starting to become examples. We have a mayor here to serve as an example of how nature can serve as a flood control project.
Yeah, I think the challenge actually is in the words, in that it sounds unserious. It sounds like something other than flood control and the sort of hardcore engineering work that the Army Corps does, that municipalities do, that planners do, that if you are looking at a nature-based solution, you are looking at an alternative to flood control as opposed to just a better way to do it. And listen, where you have paved, right, on the, you're not going to remember these names I give you, but on the Kauainui Marsh side, where they've retained the marsh, that works because we've retained the marsh. Once you've paved and channelized basically all of Honolulu, you're left with only one solution, which is dams and basins and flood control. Because to go back to a nature-based solution at that point would be condemning hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of homes, spending billions of dollars getting rid of Honolulu communities. So that's not an option where you've already done the build-out. But where you have space, it's a very serious-minded solution. I think one of the things that we have to do better at educating our colleagues about is that this is not, we're not suggesting that we do anything other than what is best for flood control, what is best for climate adaptation. It just so happens that nature does this best. Yes, Mr. Mayor.
If I could just add, I think the example exists to some extent with NESP, with the, and I don't know the acronym right off the top of my head, but NESP, which ties navigation to ecosystem restoration as a part of the Mississippi River corridor. Even the Upper Mississippi restoration efforts in our pool, we have great partnerships with the Army Corps and U.S. Fish and Wildlife, who have been island building, who have been doing river drawdowns to try to restore more of the native floodplain and some of those connections, and establishing islands to kind of slow the river down and to make it do its more of its natural thing. And that has really showed to great benefit. I think that's something we need to see more of, that effort.
Thank you. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, all of you.
Thank you.
See if I can get that on. There we go. Around the physicality of these structures and of resilience, there are economic decision makers and there are markets that are looking at this problem. And one of the things that concerns me intensely is that there are a couple of prospective crashes looming ahead about which we've been pretty much as abundantly warned as any Congress has been warned about anything ever. And yet, you know, here we are. We have 34 central bank presidents saying that the estimates of climate-related losses are large and range from $1 to $4 trillion. when considering the energy sector alone, or up to $20 trillion when looking at the economy more broadly, and going on to say that the more sophisticated studies suggest average global incomes may be reduced by up to a quarter by the end of the century. Freddie Mac, which is a mortgage company, not an environmental group, warns that rising sea levels and spreading floodplains appear likely to destroy billions of dollars in property and to displace millions of people. The economic losses and social disruption may happen gradually, but they are likely to be greater in total than those experienced in the housing crisis and the Great Recession. And of course, Mayor, you're looking at new coastal ratings policies by Moody's that potentially put the bond ratings of coastal communities at risk. Homeowners are looking at difficulties getting their hands on insurance. The 30-year mortgage may very well be a sacrifice to this. So there's some very, very big economic consequences that surround the physical resilience problems, and I wonder if you all could comment a little bit on those. Those punches actually might be pretty devastating, even apart from the actual loss of property to the oceans or to wildfires or to whatever. Ms. Lightbody, why don't you go first?
I think it's really clear that states and localities are starting to feel that and looking around for resources and expertise. You know, I travel around the country talking to these states and what they need. There's a lot of political will, as we see in the mayor and others around the country, but a lack of resources, tools, and guidance and how communities can really get ahead of this. And so I think if the federal government can provide some of that, whether it's through FEMA, whether it's through HUD's Community Development Block Grant Program, through DOT, through all of these resources that are provided to communities to equip them with the data, the information, the right maps, that they can do this, because I think there's a lot of will out there to do it.
I would say that we are looking for partnerships, especially public-private partnerships. Some of the examples that you mentioned, whether it's Freddie Mac's or insurance companies, I mean, they're sitting on billions and trillions of dollars in portfolio. If they would provide a portion of that to do prevention, to work with us on investments in communities, in infrastructure, in these types of green solutions, in the long run, that's going to be a financial windfall for them. One example that we have, again, back to the National Flood Insurance Program, our community, collectively, we've got about 700 policies. We pay about almost $750,000 every year into the program. We know we'll never see a penny come back to us in any form or sense. But if we were able to have a portion of that and invest that in our community to do preventative measures, to work on our, again, improving our marsh and water flow and those types of activities, we would much more protect and make our community better to adapt to the changing climate. So I think for us, we'd be looking for those private to partner, and that's, again, as mayors of local communities, we know that these are not just a government solution. It really involves everyone and every institution and all of us to work together.
Ms. Hill, welcome.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. I share with you your great concern about sudden turn as a result of finally the markets incorporating climate risk. In my opinion, they do not accurately reflect climate risk as we know it, given that it's a permanent change and will accelerate over time and will occur even if we were able to cut our emissions to zero. One of the techniques that we could go back to is what we turned to with the in the Great Depression, disclosure, mandating disclosure of public risks by public companies, mandating disclosure of risk in real estate transactions that the House has previously flooded in a meaningful way, not when you get the documents at the end of the transaction when you're ready to sign. And I think that there should be a growing understanding among corporate directors as to the liability they may face by failing to consider climate risk. Once the markets can absorb this information in a thoughtful manner, my hope is it would be a gradual turn.
Markets always behave in a thoughtful manner.
Yes, and we're seeing that right now. Right now, we're not seeing the risk reflected, but over time, it's my belief that we would get to behavior that would accurately or more accurately register the grave risks that we face.
Thank you.
Ms. Hill, you talked about the importance of incorporating considerations about future risk in to our building codes. So building codes are set by private organizations, yet the infrastructure may well be paid for with federal funds, insured by federal programs, or eligible for federal disaster assistance. So I absolutely agree that we need to make sure that our building codes are keeping up with reality, rather than based on just a look backwards, historical risk. In this discussion about community resilience and future extreme events, how would such a policy assist local communities preparing for disaster or rebuilding, sometimes rebuilding more than once? And then how can we hasten those changes?
Well, this is a significant challenge in the United States. We do not have a resilient building code, and the estimates are that it may take up to a decade, which is of great concern given the thought of how much we will build in the next decade. So one thing that has been mentioned is we do have a federal flood risk management standard, which made it clear that you need to elevate if you're going to build in areas at risk of flooding. If you take federal funding, I think that should be reinstated immediately. That's a clear signal to communities. Similarly, we should require all communities to adopt the latest building codes, the model building codes. Right now, they can pick and choose depending on what their state says, and in many cases there are no building codes. We saw in Houston had been I think described as anti-zoning, anti-code pre the Harvey hurricane. Harvey dumps 4 feet of rain onto Houston, and Houston has what I would term a no more moment when they decide that they really do need to elevate their buildings in the face of climate change. What we need to do is help communities do that for their new building. The retrofitting of our built infrastructure, as the mayor has already alluded to, will be a challenge. And then we need to decide when that infrastructure is damaged, do we replace it there? But whatever we choose to do, it should be built resiliently.
Right, thank you. I don't have any more questions. I think I am not anticipating any other senators returning after casting that last vote. So I'm going to conclude our hearing, but before I do, just with tremendous thanks to all of you for coming and sharing your expertise and wisdom, and I'm certain we'll be calling on you in future as we take the next steps. So with that, this meeting of the Special Committee on the Climate Crisis is closed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow, whatever meeting. Like, we're off to like the north. We mentioned to it. Yeah. It's just not so good. Just like,
Amazing. Good. They were really, really good witnesses.
Nice job.
Yeah, they compliment each other. Right, and it's, you know, we're looking at 100 years, so we're looking at.
It sounds perfectly fine all out there. She's ever has.